Your new rent is $1,850. My mother slid the paper across the kitchen table like she was handing me a grocery receipt. I stared at the number, then at her. Mom, I pay $1,050. I know, Deanne said. So this is a typo. My father, Robert, didn't even look uncomfortable. It starts in 30 days. $800 more for the same small apartment above their detached garage. No renovation, no new appliances, nothing. What exactly changed? Taxes, insurance, maintenance, Mom said quickly. I pay my own utilities, and I replaced the kitchen faucet myself last month. Dad leaned back and folded his arms. You're 30, Melody. We can't subsidize you forever. Subsidize me. I had paid them on time, every month for 4 years. Then I looked past him through the kitchen window. My younger brother Ethan's nearly new luxury SUV was sitting in the driveway. 2 weeks earlier, Ethan had lost his job. And suddenly, my rent was going up by almost exactly the amount someone would need for a very expensive car payment. I turned toward him. Ethan, how are you paying for that SUV? His eyes stayed glued to his phone. Mom answered for him. Your brother's finances are none of your business. And right then, I stopped thinking this was about rent. I picked up the notice, folded it neatly, and said, Okay, if that's the new rent, I understand. Dad's shoulders visibly relaxed. Mom gave me a small nod, almost approving. They thought I had agreed to pay it. I hadn't. For 4 years, I'd lived above my parents' garage because they'd repeatedly told me it made sense for everyone. It keeps money in the family, Dad always said. Mom preferred, why throw money away on some landlord when you have family? So I paid $1,050 every month, never late, never asking for favors. When something small broke, I usually handled it myself because calling Dad meant hearing how lucky I was to have such affordable rent. Meanwhile, Ethan's definition of adulthood had always been different. When he struggled, my parents helped. When I struggled, they reminded me I was responsible. When Ethan needed money, he was finding his way. If I questioned anything, I was keeping score. That was why I didn't argue at the kitchen table. Arguing would only give them another opportunity to make me feel guilty. Instead, I went upstairs to my apartment, placed their rent notice beside my laptop, and opened my banking app. Years of being the dependable daughter had taught me one useful habit: save money and never assume anyone else was coming to rescue me. I had enough for a deposit, enough for moving expenses, enough to leave. So I opened an apartment listing site and entered my area. The first few listings appeared. $1,475, $1,390, $1,425. I slowly looked back at the paper, demanding $1,850 for an apartment above a garage. Then I remembered Mom's reaction when I asked about Ethan's SUV. Not confusion. Defensiveness. I opened another listing. For the first time, something became very clear. My parents had raised my rent because they were certain I wouldn't leave. They knew I hated confrontation. They knew I had spent years trying not to be the difficult daughter. They had mistaken that for dependence. I clicked Scheduled Tour ***. And as the confirmation appeared on my screen, one question kept running through my mind. If my parents wanted $1,850 from me so badly, what were they going to do when I decided to give them exactly zero? The apartment I toured 2 days later made my parents' demand look even worse. The leasing agent opened the door and said, 1 bedroom, updated kitchen, reserved parking, and maintenance is included. I walked through slowly. It wasn't huge, but it was newer than the apartment above my parents' garage. The cabinets weren't chipped. The bathroom fixtures actually matched. And if the faucet broke, apparently I wouldn't be buying the replacement myself. What's the monthly rent again? I asked. 1420. I almost laughed. My parents wanted *1, 850 ***. I submitted nothing that afternoon. Not yet. There was one question I wanted answered first. That evening, I found Mom alone in the kitchen. "Can I ask you something without this turning into an argument?" She sighed. "That depends on what you ask. Does my rent increase have anything to do with Ethan?" Her expression changed for half a second. "No." "Then why exactly $800? Melody, everything costs more now." "You already said that." "And it's true." I waited. Mom began wiping an already clean counter. Then she said, "Your brother is going through a difficult period right now. You have a stable career. You have savings." There it was. That didn't answer my question. She put the cloth down. "Families help each other. I do help this family. I've paid rent every month for 4 years. You've also benefited from living here." I paid for that benefit. Her jaw tightened. "This is exactly your problem, Melody. You always have to keep score." I stared at her. Ethan could lose his job and keep driving an expensive SUV. I could pay every bill on time and somehow become selfish for asking where another $800 of my money was going. "I'm not keeping score," I said. "I'm asking what I'm being charged for." Mom turned away. Conversation over. I headed toward the stairs, but voices from my father's office stopped me. Ethan was inside. "I'm telling you, Dad, I can't make the payment next month." I stayed still. Dad lowered his voice, but the hallway was quiet enough that I heard him. "I already handled it." "How?" "Don't worry about it." Ethan said something I couldn't catch. Then Dad replied clearly. "After next month, you'll be fine." My stomach tightened. Next month. The same month my new rent started. I went upstairs without making a sound, opened my laptop, and pulled up the apartment I had toured. $1,420 per month. I clicked apply **. The following afternoon, an email arrived. Application approved. I signed the lease electronically. Paid the deposit. Then I drafted one final document. Not an argument. Not a request. A notice. I checked the date twice before sending it to both of my parents. Formal notice of termination of tenancy, 30 days. Then I clicked send ***. Mom called me less than an hour after I sent the notice. Family dinner, 7 o'clock. "Mom." 7 Melody. Then she hung up. When I walked into the dining room that evening, Dad was already sitting at the head of the table. Mom sat beside him. Ethan was there too. My printed notice lay in the middle of the table. Dad tapped it with one finger. "You're seriously moving out over a reasonable rent adjustment." "I'm moving because I found somewhere else to live." Mom stared at me. "You're abandoning your family over money." That word caught my attention. Abandoning. Ethan finally looked up. "You know, most landlords would have charged you more years ago. You've been lucky." I turned toward him. "Okay, then answer something for me." His expression shifted. "Is the extra $800 supposed to pay for your SUV?" Nobody spoke. Ethan looked at Dad. Dad looked at Mom. That silence answered more than a denial could have. "Wow," I said quietly. Mom threw her hands up. "It's only temporary, until your brother gets back on his feet." Everything stopped. Even Ethan stared at her. I leaned forward. "So it is for Ethan." "That isn't what I said." "It's exactly what you said." Dad cut in. "Melody, you earn more than your brother. You can afford to contribute. His car payment isn't my rent." Ethan's face reddened. "Do you have to humiliate me over this?" I looked directly at him. "Paying your own car bill is humiliating, but secretly charging your sister for it is." "Enough," Mom snapped. I turned back to her. You told me the increase was taxes, insurance, and maintenance. We're trying to help this family. No, you decided I would help without asking me. Mom shook her head. Fine, move out. When you realize how expensive the real world is, don't come crawling back. I didn't argue. My new apartment is $1,420. Dad's expression changed. Mom blinked. I continued. The lease is signed. The deposit is paid. Dad straightened. You already signed. Yes. When are you leaving? I gave him the date. For the first time since this started, my father didn't have a lecture ready. He pushed his chair back so abruptly it scraped across the floor. Then he walked toward his office. I started gathering my things from the table when I heard Mom follow him into the hallway. Their voices dropped, but not enough. Dad said one sentence that made me stop. If she actually leaves, we're short more than Ethan's payment. The next morning, Dad knocked on my apartment door before I left for work. When I opened it, he didn't mention Ethan. He didn't mention taxes either. I've been thinking, he said. We could make the rent $1,500. I stared at him. Yesterday it had to be $1,850. I'm trying to compromise. I already signed another lease. You can probably get out of it. I don't want to. His face tightened. Melody, don't make a permanent decision because you're angry. I'm not angry. I'm moving. I closed the door. The next evening, Mom tried. She caught me carrying boxes to my car. Forget the increase, she said. Keep paying the original $1,050. I lowered the box. What happened to the higher taxes and insurance? She paused. That's not the point. Actually, it was exactly the point. If they genuinely needed another $800 to cover the apartment's expenses, they couldn't suddenly make those expenses disappear because I was leaving. They weren't worried about losing the increase. They were terrified of losing the asterisk $1,050. They already depended on asterisk. Over the next week, their questions became relentless. Will the landlord refund your deposit? Have you checked the cancellation clause? Why rush this? Each time, I gave the same answer. I'm moving. 3 days before the movers arrived, I went into the main house to collect an old storage box. That was when I noticed a folder lying open on the dining table. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. The cover page was visible. Home refinance. I stood there remembering something Dad had proudly said months earlier. They had helped Ethan get established. His car. His bills. The periods when he was between jobs. Suddenly, Dad's comment at dinner made sense. They weren't just trying to extract an extra $800 from me. My original rent had already become part of whatever financial structure they had built around rescuing Ethan. On moving day, the truck pulled into the driveway at 9. By noon, my apartment was empty. Mom stood beside the garage, watching the movers load my final boxes. You can still stop this, she said. No, Mom. Dad held out his hand. I placed the keys in his palm. Then tires crunched against the driveway behind us. Ethan's SUV pulled in. He climbed out holding an envelope, his face tight. He marched straight toward Mom and Dad. What is this? Dad went pale. Ethan shook the overdue payment notice in front of him. I gave you money toward this. Nobody answered. Then Ethan looked from Dad to Mom and demanded, What did you do with the money I gave you? Dad looked at the overdue notice in Ethan's hand, then at me standing beside the moving truck. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Finally, Mom said, We were trying to keep everything under control. Ethan shook the notice. I asked what happened to my money. Dad exhaled. We used it where it was needed. Where? That was when the whole arrangement finally came out. Ethan had been using what remained of his savings to cover part of the SUV payment after losing his sales job. He believed Mom and Dad were temporarily covering whatever he couldn't manage. But the SUV wasn't the only problem. There were old credit card bills they had helped Ethan with, part of the SUV down payment, and living expenses they had covered during his periods without steady income. Dad admitted they had refinanced the house to consolidate much of that debt. And my $1,050 rent asterisk had quietly become dependable monthly income they counted on to keep everything balanced. I looked at Mom. So the $800 increase. She hesitated. Dad answered. Ethan's car payment is $780. There it was. They had rounded it up to $800 and called it rent. You knew I wouldn't agree to pay his car payment, I said. Mom's voice softened. Melody, we were trying to keep the family afloat. No, you made a financial decision for me without telling me. We thought you could handle it. That's the problem. She stared at me. I kept my voice calm. The worst part isn't that you wanted to help Ethan. It's that you decided what he wanted mattered more than my right to decide what happens to my own money. Dad rubbed his forehead. We thought you'd complain, but eventually understand. You thought I'd stay. Neither of them denied it. I looked toward the empty apartment above the garage. For 4 years, you called me lucky while depending on my rent. When you needed even more money, you lied about why. Mom stepped closer. We never treated you like some stranger. No, you treated me like guaranteed income. Ethan lowered the overdue notice. For once, he wasn't defending them. You told me everything was handled, he said to Dad. You never told me you were piling up debt because of me. Dad started explaining again, but Ethan cut him off. I should have sold the car when I lost my job. I glanced at the moving truck. I have to go. Mom looked stunned. You're still leaving. After we explained everything. Especially after you explained everything. I got into my car and followed the movers to my new apartment. My parents listed the garage unit for *1, 850 **. It sat empty. Prospective tenants could find newer apartments with better amenities for less, just as I had. After several weeks, Mom and Dad reduced the price substantially. Without my dependable $1,050 arriving every month, they had to restructure their budget and deal with the debt they had accumulated. Ethan sold the luxury SUV before the situation got worse. After finding another job, he bought an inexpensive used car and started paying his own expenses. The rescue cycle stopped. Not because everyone suddenly agreed with me. Because there was no longer an automatic source of money to keep it going. Meanwhile, I was paying *1, 420 * for my new apartment, $430 less than what my parents had demanded. Maintenance was included. I had my own parking space. And nobody could turn someone else's car payment into my rent. Months later, Mom called. After a few minutes of small talk, she hesitated. We're a little short on one of the payments this month. Could you possibly help? No. Silence. I didn't explain. I didn't defend myself. And I didn't negotiate. Eventually, Ethan admitted something I never expected to hear from him. They protected me from consequences, he said, and you ended up paying for it. I know. I'm sorry. I accepted the apology. But I didn't volunteer to fix anything. For the first time, every adult in our family was responsible for their own choices. My parents raised my rent because they thought I would always pay for being the responsible child. I didn't fight them, bargain with them, or beg them to be fair. I simply left. And for the first time, the bills they created belonged to the people who created them.